And now let's get right into the session. We are thrilled to be able to bring this conversation to this year's virtual Skoll World Forum. I'd like to extend a special thank you to Making Conversation, the organization that proposed and designed this session. And with that, I'd like to introduce our session host, founder of Making Conversation, Fred Dust. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. I'm delighted to be here, and thanks to the panel that we've gotten. We've gotten Uzo, Keri, Kamal, and Claudia. You're going to get to meet all of these lovely, amazing, illuminating storytellers. So I'm really looking forward to it. But I thought I would start by just kind of giving a little bit of a sense of where this came from and why we decided this was the place to begin. Or to think about. About 3 years ago, I was at Skoll World Forum and was kind of like, I would say, strong-armed into a panel that was actually on the power of story. It was Kat Cizik and Tabitha Jackson and a bunch of really amazing voices. And Kat talked, she opened the session by talking about graffiti and the idea that graffiti was a way of kind of reminding people all the way through history that we were here, that I was here, I'm still here. And as we ended, what we began to realize is that we need more ways to tell the story of how we are here together, that we are going forward together, that it's not an individual story, it's a story of a collective as we move forward into the future together. And so that was the inspiration for us as we kind of made our proposal for Skoll this year, which is that more than ever, it feels like we need to be telling the story of us being here together and moving forward in a way that takes us forward together. So that's what we're going to work on a little bit today, is telling stories that move us forward or illuminate us. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the idea of Illuminations and why we called it Illuminations. For those of you who've ever come across a medieval manuscript or someplace like where there's a text or a sacred text, often in the margins there'll be these little illuminations, little drawings that are just explaining a little bit more of the text or distracting you from the text, or says something simple like "Help! I'm a monk locked in a monastery. Get me out of here." You know, it's like something like that. And those little illuminations are these super short stories that really are compelling. And so I really wanted us to start by kind of talking a bit about the idea of illuminations, and we'll use our panels to model it. But before I do, let me explain an illumination for you all, and then we'll go right into it. And we'll start with Claudia, because I know you're like raring. So an illumination, I'll tell you my great-grandmother's story. My great-grandmother worked in a steel mill by night, and then as a farmer by day, and she did that because she wanted money. She wanted her own pocket money. And one morning she was coming home from work and she was walking up the drive, and gradually out of the blue, she was just exhausted. This blue thing started floating down in front of her face, slowly, slowly, slowly. And then it turns out it was sexy Jesus, and he winked at her and she had the power to go on. So that's an illumination. My great-grandmother was phenomenal at telling illuminating stories. And there's 4 components of what an illumination does. It's super short. That's like 30 seconds. I'm letting you guys have a little bit more extra time if you want. It kind of ends where the story begins. You're like, okay, what's next? Did she invite like Jesus in? Like we have no idea what happens. It has prevailing emotion. Like there's kind of funniness and awe. And also it actually kind of explains some sense of values. You can tell that she has like a strong work ethic. She was a woman of faith. There was a bunch of things in here. And then last, I'll say it ends with a twist. Like you basically are like, I'm going to show up at the chair, at the rocking chair tomorrow because I want to hear what she has to say. So that's an illumination. My great-grandmother was really good at it. I'm pretty good at it. But now let's see how our panelists are. So Claudia, I'd love you to kind of give a couple of phrases about who you are, and then give us your 30-second illumination.
And Fred, you're so good at this. You really like raised the bar. Okay, a couple of things about me. I love stories. I love to read them more than tell them, but here I am on this panel. I also teach law and gender studies at UCLA. I'm a civil rights attorney, but for purposes of this panel, I'm the executive director of Four Freedoms, which is a national arts organization. And my illumination, just not as short as Fred's, is that I'm a huge animal lover. So we went to the Bwindi rainforest in order to trek the gorillas. And I was really excited about this. My husband and my best friend at the time were not. They were just sort of blindly following my passions. We got there and the rangers told us, do not move when the silverback charges you. And I said, for sure, I will not move. I'm so excited to see the gorillas. And the silverback charged us, and I sprinted away, as did everybody else we were with, while the rangers yelled at us, stop moving. The second time around, I did not move. I barely even flinched. That's it.
Well done. That's really good. And that's a great, and Claudia, no, it's pretty good. It's very good. It explains a little bit about your character, that that you're like literally like, you know, like got a little bit of kind of like, I'm not gonna follow the rules. Like, it's like there's a lot in there, and it's like it's scary and exciting, and we want to hear about the second part, the second season. So that's great. You did a good job. Kamal.
Okay, so I read the chapter on Illuminations in the book yesterday, and it said they could be up to 3 minutes, so I did 90 seconds.
That's fine. And Kamal, just to quickly talk about a little bit where you are. I mean, who you are and what you're up to really quickly. So yes.
Sure. My name is, Kamal Sinclair. I'm the executive director of an organization called the Guild of Future Architects. But prior to that, I got a chance for 8 years to work with Keri Putnam at the Sundance Institute. So that is who I am. I'm in Los Angeles on Tongva land. All right. Shall I do my? Okay.
Bring it on. 90 seconds.
I look forward to the critique. Okay. So my last living slave ancestor died in 1963 at almost 100 years old. On that day, my oldest sibling was just learning to walk, just blocks away. So that is how close the identity of being an enslaved person is to me. So you can imagine my excitement in 1999 when I got to return to the coast that my ancestors were taken from in West Africa. I remember visiting the slave quarters in the Gambia and reflecting that this is no longer the door of no return, because I have brought some portion of their flesh and blood back to this spot. I was with a group of African-American artists from New York City, working with Sierra Leone refugees. And we were walking through Lamon Village, feeling really proud and the sense of return. And as we were walking, people were like, hey, Tubob, hey, Tubob. And we were like, hey, what's up? Like feeling really welcomed home. And then later that night, we asked our host, so what does Tubob mean? And they said slave catcher.
Oh.
So they explained that over time, slave catcher became synonymous with foreigner, but it was so ironic that this group of Black folks from the States, the children of the children of the children, those that were caught, were now being called that. So that is the complexity of our living histories in our living context.
Okay, so Kamal, that was exceptional. Like, you could have stopped right at the slaveholder, and then we would have actually gone out and figured out what it meant, because we'd have been so intrigued. I mean, that's what's really interesting about a great illumination, is when it leaves you hanging like that. You're kind of like, oh wait, I need to know more. Either I'm gonna catch up with Kamal and she's gonna tell me more, or I'm gonna do the research on it. So it did all the things that we needed to do. Like, you did pretty well. Like you get like a, I'd say like a A-. No, an A. It's like, all right, Carrie.
Well, I don't want to be graded, Fred. I'm very nervous about this, and especially going after Kamal, who's such a I had the pleasure of working with Kamal. She herself is a wonderful artist and storyteller, and it's wonderful to hear. All of you on this panel are incredible, so thank you for inviting me. My name's Carrie, and I run the Sundance Institute, and before that, I was an executive making movies and television for many years prior to that. So I love working with storytellers, and I love working with artists, but I'm probably less of a practice storyteller than the others on this panel. So I will do my best here. Mine is also a bit longer, and I too read the chapter. So I'm going to tell a story about my grandfather, who is a hero to me. In his 20s, he worked to support both his parents and his in-laws through the Great Depression. He later became a really successful accountant, retired early to a house on the Jersey Shore, where my brothers and I spent every summer. And when my mom and dad struggled financially, he paid for our school, he paid for our mortgage. He loved to garden, he loved to play cards, he loved driving his powder blue Lincoln Continental, never above the speed limit. And every year, he and my grandmother drove across the United States and back. He kept a file cabinet full of maps with his routes marked, and a wall map with push pins of every motel where they had spent a night. And when my grandmother died when I was 10, we took the trip with him. I was really different from him. I liked to read novels and daydream impractical things, and I didn't like math very much. But I wanted to learn from him, and I wanted to know him. And one day I was looking out on the road as I sat in the front seat on a long flat stretch of highway somewhere between Illinois and Kansas. And I asked him, how far can a person see? And he said, 8 miles. After that, the earth curves and you can't see any further. And I thought about this and I said, well, what if the earth were flat? How far could you see? And then he said, well, that's a silly question. The curve is there. You can only see 8 miles. Silence. And it took me a while to get brave enough to ask again, what if you looked up in the sky? How far could we see? And he looked at me now and he said, I have no idea. I never thought about that. And that comes back to me a lot because I remember how sad I felt then and how that sadness was mingled with love for him because I knew that his life had required him to keep on his eyes on the road for all of us.
Keri, I love that story. As you know, I know that story. It makes me a little bit moved. I think what's interesting for me about that is it illustrates a lot about you, a lot about your vision. I also have to say, having the good fortune of sitting under stars with you in various contexts, I know you've gotten to look up quite a bit, and I thank your the fact that somebody actually was driving so you could do that. I have no fault with that story. Uzo, thank you. Uzo, would you be willing to wrap us?
Yeah, I can do that, but I didn't know I was going to go last on this. Okay, so hi everybody. My name is Uzodinma Iweala. I am the CEO of the Africa Center, which is a multidisciplinary cultural institution here in New York City. And I had a story that I was going to tell, but I think I'm going to switch it up and tell this one very quickly, which is about, well, basically what happens is this. I was probably in my early 20s, and it was one of the first times I had decided to, or sorry, no, earlier than that. I decided to travel to Nigeria. My family is from Nigeria. My parents came to the United States. My mom when she was in college, my dad a little bit later. And we grew up going back to Nigeria, but always with our parents. It's really embarrassing, sorry, but always with our parents. On one of my first trips by myself to Nigeria, I decided to go down and see an uncle who lived in this city called Port Harcourt, which is about an hour away from the capital where my parents lived. So I got down there, okay, I flew, it was fine. And on the way back, when I was coming, my uncle dropped me off at the airport. And this was a time before everybody had a cell phone in Nigeria. So you can tell this was a bit ago. I had a cell phone, but at the same time, I had run out of credit on my cell phone. And I couldn't, it's pay as you go. And I was having trouble getting in touch with folks, but, my uncle dropped me off at the airport. And then we all, did the whole thing. Getting on an airplane in Nigeria can be a very harrowing experience for those of you who have been, you know what I'm talking about. For those of you who haven't been, I wouldn't wish it upon my worst enemy ever. Anyway, we get to the airplane, we all board, and it's one of these old McDonnell Douglas, like DC-25s, like one of these old planes. Basically, you get in, you sit down, and all of the instructions are in Ukrainian. They're in like Cyrillic text. So I'm like, well, I don't really know what we're going to do with this, but as long as we can get back to Abuja today, that will be fine. We all sit down, everybody buckles up, the plane starts to move. And then all of a sudden, as we're taxiing, everything just goes black and the plane just shuts down and stops on the tarmac. And no one wants to say anything until finally from somewhere in the back, some older woman with a Nigerian accent goes, na engine failure. And then another person, because Nigerians are notoriously funny in sort of like very tense situations, goes, it's okay, we'll manage it. And then a third person gets up and says, you can manage some things, but you can't manage life. Me, I'm getting off this plane. So there's now a commotion as they force the pilot to open the door. And we all descend onto the tarmac while the pilots who hadn't seen until now, who happen to be folks, and I'm going to call them Ukrainian because that's what I think they are. And I think that's what everybody thinks they are at this point, start running from the cockpit down to the engines, looking at the nose cone of the airplane, just looking at everything, until finally one of them gets a bright idea and they bring a ground generator. And I'm talking about like one of those ones that really does look like a ground generator. They attach it to one of the engines and essentially jumpstart this airplane. Now we all have a situation. We're sitting on the tarmac. About half of us, we're all 100% of us on the tarmac. Some of us are looking. It's the last flight out of Port Harcourt. People are like, you know what? You can't manage life. I'm staying. And then there are those of us who, I don't have a cell phone anymore because my battery is dead and I can't call my uncle. I can't call my parents, and I have to decide, do I get on this airplane or do I not? So after about 20 minutes of fierce arguing, everyone, arguing amongst themselves, half of us decide to get back on the airplane. And I say, you know what, I'm just gonna get back on the airplane. So I do, and end up sitting next to this police officer, this guy in uniform who's also flying back to Abuja that night. And as the plane starts to move again, he sees that I'm extremely tense. I'm shaking, like holding the seat, because I'm like, what have I done? And he just looks at me and he says, listen, if God wants us to live today, we'll live. If he wants us to die today, we'll die. And I was like, all right, well, okay, I guess that's cool. So we take off.
By the way, you should stop right there.
We'll stop there. All right, let me stop.
Because we know you lived, but it shows a little bit about your courage and the way you go forwards. And it's true. There's always people being like, it's like, I can think about so many airplane stories, specifically landing in African countries that actually that would be entertaining. We could do a whole Skoll World Forum on times that land planes. It's a great story, Uzo. Thank you. And I will just tell you, I'm 100% Ukrainian, so I would have gotten on.
All right, well, you and me both.
Yeah, exactly. So that's my illumination. I'm 100% Ukrainian, and I'd have gotten on the plane. So it's like, so I want to move forward to the first kind of question of the panel. And by the way, please in the chat, feel free to leave questions. Feel free to leave illuminations. Feel free to let like anything that comes forward. But we do have some serious prepared questions that we're going to go through. And I want to kind of start actually with and I'm going to call on certainly people. For Kamal and Claudia, this is really for you. I'd love to have you talk a little bit about the work you do day to day and what the role of story is in the work you do and what kinds of stories you use. And so I'm going to start, Kamal, with you, if you don't mind. And remind me, how long have you known Claudia for?
Since she was 16, so since the 90s, mid 90s, late 90s. And I remember when she didn't tell you guys that not only was it that gorilla backstory, but she also went to the Tiger Temple in Thailand, I believe, and just basically, hung out.
Yeah, we
grown tigers.
Yeah, we have a sense of. I mean, Claudia's in Costa Rica right now in the jungle. Like we have a sense of where Claudia likes to hang, what she likes to hang with. So Kamal, would you be willing to talk a little about the stuff that?
So at the Guild of Future Architects, we are a collective of people from all different kind of backgrounds and different areas of expertise. And this is actually something that I learned when I was at Sundance, the need to really create space for inclusive imagination, for democratized imagination as we start to think about what are these systems we're building in our future. So we've been running, last year during the pandemic, we ran 1,000 hours of futurist writers' rooms, where we bring in groups of up to 100 people in a room with provocations to kind of find not only what aspirational futures we might want and try to ground them in lived experience, so we understand not just some, flights of fancy, but really what does it mean to be alive in 50 years or 30 years, and how are we setting the tracks for that? But we also went back in time and we looked at moments in our history where we could have made a different choice and played out scenarios, what if? And that was really illuminating around uncovering design principles. Like, for example, really quick, we were working with Rockefeller on the future of food systems, and they went back to the 1970s when they decided to, the US Senate decided to invest in factory farms over family farms. And that, a lot of food experts say, is the beginning of foodborne illness and the epidemic of foodborne illness that we have today. And when we went back to look at who were those senators and Congress people, why did they make that decision? Of course, we thought of all the capitalistic reasons and all these things. But when we looked at them, they were children during the Depression or young adults, or they were the parents of the boomer generation. So they saw starvation in our country and more mouths to feed than ever in our country. So one of the design principles that got extracted from that storytelling process was, how do we design so we don't, how do we design in response to trauma? So that we design to mitigate it, but we don't design to basically create unforeseen consequences. So that's just an example of how storytelling has been really rigorous in my daily life.
No, and it's actually, I mean, there's a couple things that really resonate with me, Kamal, which is like, you know, I often talk about why we tell the stories of the distant future, which is that we often can't agree on the tomorrow that we need. And so when we look far, or when we look way into the past, we actually see kind of like, we can imagine harmonies that may not exist. And so those stories really become important. One of my feelings is that we've unfortunately raised ourselves on dystopian literature the last kind of 30 years or so. And so what do we know how to make?
That's true, very true.
Utopia. Claudia, I'd love to hear about how you use this work. And it really can be in either examples. I might ask you to do it about the work that you do, not for freedoms, because I think the prompt that you're gonna do is gonna come out of the work that you're talking about, so.
Oh, true. So I don't know if y'all know, but Fred wrote this book called Making Conversations, and that's what this panel's about. I put it in the chat, and I think someone else linked it. But there's this really great chapter that many of us read about Illuminations in general. It talks about how in the Middle Ages, there was these manuscripts that were written, and people, you know, shared them with each other. Not everybody was literate, so some read them to each other. But really, it was to learn from stories, which is like the entire history of humanity. But somehow, here in the United States, I feel like maybe because we're a young nation, it just doesn't happen as much as it happens in other cultures, especially indigenous cultures that sit around the fire, tell story type of thing. And I've noticed as a professor that my students learn so much better from stories, right? I can show them graphs, I can tell them statistics all day long. And in the moment, they might be very moved by statistics. And then they forget the entire point of like what we were discussing in the first place because they can't internalize it. So years ago, I instituted this sort of storytelling piece to all my classes. It doesn't matter what I'm teaching, whether it's disability rights law or trauma-informed lawyering, or most recently I taught trauma, body, and gender. And I start off every class giving a prompt where students need to answer that prompt with a story. And we're going to do some of the prompts here in the panel, but the point is to get them to learn the importance of storytelling, right? And that everybody else, as they're listening, can internalize the lessons, and also to recognize that learning from each other's lived experiences is a much deeper form of education than any of us can experience. That's, you know, I think more meaningful than all the theory I teach them. I still teach them theory, but they get a lot more out of the stories they hear from each other.
Yeah. It's really interesting because one of the things that I like about the story, the format that we're talking about, Illuminations, is that it's like it doesn't answer the question for you, right? So it's like, so it's the same thing, Kamal. Like it doesn't give you the answer. It basically leaves you hanging, and then you have to kind of like begin to invent what you think that is. And there's two reasons that's important. One is, like, as I said, it's like that lets your imagination get kind of unfettered, and then it also means that I'll show up the next day because I want to hear what's the next story. So I think there's a lot about kind of like of the art of a short story. By the way, a pilot, Uzo, said quite clearly in the chat that he would not get back on that plane. So it turns out both your and my ideas were wrong. I'm going to go on to the next the next question, if that's okay, because I'd love to hear from Carrie and Uzo on this. And I was really thinking about you as heads of institutions that really rely and cultivate stories in the world in really powerful ways, Sundance and the Africa Center. And Uzo, I know you're in the middle of a big project on stories right now, which is that I guess I'm really curious about, given the current like state and like where we are right now, what some of the tensions are you're seeing in the stories that are being developed and how that plays. And I'll leave it to either of you to start if you want to reflect on it a little bit. But you know, Carrie, you just came out of a highly successful, really stunning, thank you, you and the whole institution, Festival of Storytelling, and I'm curious, just even in that, like, what were some of the tensions you were grappling with?
Well, I mean, there's, I'm sure, Uzo, we can go back and forth on this a little bit because there's so much to talk about in this area. There's actually something I just wanted to respond to, if it's okay, Fred, that Claudia said, that because I feel it's embedded in this conversation, and it's something, you know, you talked about how particularly in American culture, or maybe in Western culture, we're not learning from stories as much as, maybe we're not telling each other stories in the same ways that we could. We rely on data, we rely on science. I really agree with that. And I really feel, but I also feel that there's another frame to that too. I actually think there are a lot of stories that are embedded in Western culture and American culture. We just don't recognize them. They inform a lot of what we do. And I think there's a Rebecca Solnit quote that I love that really talks about that, which is, stories surround us like air. We breathe them in, we breathe them out. And the art of being fully conscious in personal life means seeing the stories and becoming their teller, rather than letting them be the unseen forces that tell you what to do. And I think that really informs our work at Sundance. It really informs the idea of helping, and Claudia, you said it, helping people understand how to listen to one another, let the stories bubble from real people to one another, whether it's an illumination or a longer story, a more crafted story of the types that we work on at Sundance, and Uzo may be working on through the art that he supports. But one of the things I think about is it isn't just what the story is, it's who's, or what the story is about. It's who the storyteller is and where the story is told from, and who it's about. So the idea of authorship, who's telling the story about whom, and how, those are really important questions for us right now. You know, too often storytelling can become a sort of an extractive act by, one person or one group of people about other groups of people. You've seen this in a tradition of documentary storytelling from the very beginnings. And I think now we're really at a place where we're reconsidering what it means to have agency over one's own story, and looking at certainly at a dominant media landscape in the media storytelling that Sundance works in predominantly, and even in theater, commercial theater certainly, where we've seen a stunning lack of representation of a variety of voices. And I think to be able to say, it's actually important that we have a wide range of storytellers telling their own stories, and we really are inquisitive about whose story is being represented by whom. So I just want to put that in the room. And that's not exactly your question, Fred, about what we went through this last pandemic year in creating the festival. I'm happy to talk about that more, but I did want to center that because I think it's probably the core question, we're all looking at in our cultural organizations.
Yeah, and in the chat we're getting a lot of kind of response that I think you're right, Carrie. And Uzo, I want to go to you, but I think there's another thing here, which is that there's an implicit storyline in the news hook that we are kind of forced to follow, that unless we actually recognize that kind of invisible stories that are in the air, we actually end up being scripted by the stories that we don't want to be scripted by. So I think there's much to what you're saying. Uzo, I'd love to hear what your thoughts on.
I mean, I think a lot of what we do and sort of what I think about on a daily basis has to do with, Carrie, some of the questions that you brought up. And I think about it from maybe two angles, which I'll try to quickly summarize. One is, as being from a group, and, I'm talking about being a Black person, being an African person, like where our stories are usually told. And, there's the question of do you have agency in it? Like, that's one of the things that the institution I run is really very much about. And, the thing that you mentioned, Fred, earlier was that we're working on is an exhibition about immigration and the African immigrant story to the United States of America, which has multiple parts from way back. We're talking about hundreds of years ago, with involuntary movement of people through, forced migration, to, the wave essentially that started in the 70s or 80s that brought my parents to the country. And how do you put that story on blast, number one? And how do you then have that story exist in conversation with, as a story that has traditionally been pushed to the side, all right, not acknowledged as fundamentally real or like really truly part of the American story? How do you thrust that right into the American immigrant narrative, and how does it sit, and how are people forced to feel uncomfortable about both its presence and its exclusion in terms of the making of the national story, is one thing that I think about in terms of representation. But this also goes back into two other things. One is like the work that I used to do when I was working in public health. And I wrote this book about HIV and the stories told about HIV, especially on the continent of Africa, predominantly because there's a lot of representation of that in the drive to put on the page or put in front of people dehumanizes the people that it's trying to represent, which I think is a tragedy. And I think, Carrie, this speaks to some of the stuff you were talking about in terms of appropriation of story, or construction of story. But then it moves into another thing I think that you were speaking about that I see a lot of the time, and I think somebody actually mentioned it in the chat as well, which is like, then who has the right to tell what story? And as a novelist who, or a writer who's written about like many different things, a lot of like that I haven't experienced. I wrote a book about child soldiers, really not anywhere close to my life. That question comes up a lot, which is, and it's one that I'm faced with a lot in terms of the teaching that I do here at NYU. Who has the right to tell what story, and how can you get into telling a story? And I think that is two-pronged, and then I'll shut up. One is that I think people are generally lazy about telling stories. I'm just going to put it out there, right? Which is, people think that in the world we live in, if you take a story that isn't yours and you decide to tell it, that you should get kudos for telling that story. And I think that was predominantly, like, that was a way that people operated before. And, I remember being taught by Jamaica Kincaid, and her thing was like, if you are writing about a farmer and you tell me the story that in your story that the soil tastes like arsenic, this was the example she loved to use. She'd ask, well, have you tasted arsenic? And so it's that idea that, like, if you're going to like make these statements or pronouncements about a set of people, or whatever, that you have to have immersed yourself in and really become very, very deeply oriented. You don't have to be, right? Like, so you don't have to be of this particular identity or demographic or whatever to tell a story, but you have to be close, right? You have to be inside that, the way that people in that space think. And that requires a huge amount of empathy that I think we don't realize how much work that actually takes as a society. And then the second point is just to, like, then when you try, what happens if you try and you get it wrong? And I think that's what, people get very, like, grumpy or irritated about, right? Which is this idea that, like, oh, if I try to do this and I do it the wrong way, everybody's just going to cancel me. I'm going to be done. And I think Fred, you and I have talked about this a bit, which is like this idea of how people are now using cancel culture, something that I think really has to do with shame as a positive tool for orienting people around a common social goal, and moving it into this thing like a scapegoat for, like, not trying, basically. And I think the idea is, like, shame is not always bad. And, like, you can try, like, I can try and write a story about, say, from the perspective of a woman and get it wrong. And somebody should tell me that I got it wrong. But that doesn't necessarily mean, if you've done it in the right way, that you should be X'd from telling stories for the end of eternity. But it also doesn't mean that you shouldn't be told that you got it wrong. And I think those are some of the tensions that come up a lot in the sort of, like, discourse around storytelling.
I really want to just jump back in, Fred, because I left a few questions open, and I want to hear from Claudia and Kamal as well. But I want to just clarify, I really love what you just said. And I want to say, I don't think this is a simple answer of, I think it would be very dangerous, actually, to say that only someone of a particular identity can tell a story about that identity. I think that would be harm for everyone, because it would limit everyone. I think what gets commingled often are the asymmetries in who has traditionally been financed and enabled to tell stories on our most dominant channels, and what is restorative in terms of justice in that respect. And so there's that issue that's dominant specifically in media storytelling, I think, a lot. And then there's the question of what's actually a sort of an equitable process of having an empathic authorship conversation that allows for the very appropriate questions that you were just asking, that I think should apply to everybody in telling a story as an artist, that is a story filled with empathy. Those two things often commingle, I think, and that has to be unpicked a little bit, because I do think that they're different. But the idea of, for Sundance at least, our position isn't a rigid one. Our position isn't, we will only accept a story about a community if that storyteller is of that community. It's more nuanced. It will be, what was the methodology? What was the partnership? What was the true co-creation or empathy? And really looking at, as best as we can, at the context. And that's the work, I think, of curators. That's the work of artists, and that's the work of audiences too, to hold those storytellers accountable.
Yeah, no, I think the notion of kind of really exploring the roots of how a story gets made, and really kind of understanding that is kind of core to the work that you're both doing. Claudia, Kamal, any thoughts on this really quickly? And then I have a quick thought, and I want to move us on to the next thing. But Kamal, Claudia.
Claudia, you want to go? No, okay, turn up. Yeah, no, I think that, I always think about this going back to like just even interpersonal relationships and how there's a story that is authentic and is compelling inside me that needs to be expressed. It's part of your journey on this planet. If you don't tell your own story, somebody else will, and they may not get it right. So I think we absolutely have to tell our own stories and have a platform to do it. But then also, like Claudia, I've known since we were teenagers. She tells me stories about me, and then I see myself in a whole different perspective, and I go, oh, especially because she's so smart and she sees me sometimes better than I see myself. So there's a little bit of like, how are we creating those 360 complex, dynamic relationships to stories so we can constantly be learning from each other. So I think it is very complex. It's not, there's no one rigid way, but I think the intentionality is really important. And being open to when I had this one person come to me after seeing something that was about, anyway, it was just really interesting because the context of the indigenous context it was this story of like, oh, a woman in an indigenous context got to be a leader in a tribe for the first time around this particular thing. And the woman from that context goes, well, the thing is where we came from, women were always considered connected to aspects of the metaphysical world in ways that men weren't. So it wasn't that this woman achieved something like in a Western feminist lens, it was that this whole process was to give men a glimpse of what women had naturally. And so just even those kinds of contexts, like it's just completely different frameworks. And if you don't have the conversation and even put it out there that you're seeing it through this Western feminist lens, and then somebody else can come and say, actually, we don't even have that framework. Let me tell you how a non-Western patriarchal lens has already existed in our community for millennia. And so it gets really complicated. I don't know if that's
No, it's interesting. And Kamal, it's like Claudia told me a little story about why she agreed to join this panel. That was actually, it was the opposite of complex. She was like, oh yeah, I just heard it'll be fun. And I was like, great. Okay, so I'm just like the fun one.
Could I say my quick line, which is that everybody should just be telling more stories.
Exactly. I mean, if there's one thing I want us to get out of this, and then I think this is one thing the whole panel has agreed on all the way through as we've been kind of forming this, is that it's like more stories of more kinds, more voices. Like it's like this is not about restricting; it's about kind of expansion. We don't really want to lose any stories. They're really important. And Uzo, I'll tell you a really quick story on pro-social gossip. Which is that. When I was in Peru, I'm spending time in the Amazon. I'm looking at activists and specifically women activists in Peru. And I spent time with a farmer she had a mango farm in the Amazon. And she told me how she ended domestic violence in her village. And the ways she did it, like literally, is there's a thing called vaso de leche where they would give milk out every morning to the children in the village as they went to school. And all the people who were together, they're mostly women, were actually gossiping together all the time. And so they were able to identify who all the domestic abusers were in the village. So this woman went around to all these apex kind of like predators and was like, oh, so-and-so beats his wife. That's pretty weak, huh? And just by kind of doing that over time, she basically shamed Uzo, the village men, into kind of basically kind of like shifting the way that they actually think about things. So there's a really powerful story of change done in a very sneaky, thoughtful, creative way. I'm going to now cede control over everything and pass it over to Claudia, who's going to make us really jump through all kinds of tricky hoops. So go for it.
Yes, indeed. Okay, so this is Illumination lightning round. I'm going to give you a prompt, and your goal is to answer it in 30 seconds or less, highlights only, right? This is like the trailer version. Answer the prompt. I'm going to cut you off if you start talking on too long and adding too many details. I'm just kidding, but I'd like for you to be scared. Okay, prompt number one, and whoever's got one, raise your hand. And if nobody raises their hand within the first few seconds, I will call on one of you. All right. The prompt
just calling us. I think it's just calling us.
Oh, and Fred, you're going first because everybody else has had to do something first and you haven't had it yet. So Fred, tell a story about a time you were misunderstood or when you deeply misunderstood something yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you the story that was the illumination that I kind of let you know, which is that most of my childhood, I think I was well, I don't know, I think I might have been understood, and I didn't know I was understood, but I knew I was gay. I knew I was gay since I was like 6, basically, but I went to my father's private school. He was the headmaster of my school, and he wanted a perfect kid. Like, he wanted the blonde soccer playing, date the cheerleaders, and so, you know, I gave him that. Until I was 15, and then I ran away to France. And boy, was I not that.
Wonderful. Of course, we all want to know what happened.
It gets a little NC-17 there, so.
All right, the next one is tell a story about letting go.
I guess maybe I can go. So I remember when I was in 3rd grade, and my mom came to pick us up. You know, I have 3 siblings. We're all pretty close in age, 2 years apart. My mom came to pick us up to take us shopping for Halloween candy, because it was Halloween that day. So my mom gets us from school. She's wearing her full Nigerian gear, which she always wears. My mom is pretty well known, so if you've seen her, you'll know what I'm talking about. She takes us to, I think it was a CVS in Montgomery Mall, and we're buying the candy. We get up to the cashier, we're buying the candy, and I really, really wanted a pack of Reese's Pieces. But my parents are, you know, pretty strict Nigerian parents, so I knew she wasn't going to let us buy them. So as she's paying for the candy, I stick my hand down, you know, like how these shops are organized, where the candy is like perfect candy height at you know, for kids, right? I stick my hand down and pick up the Reese's Pieces, and I'm about to put it in my pocket when the cashier, who's this sort of like Black woman around the same age as my mom, I think signals to my mom. My mom looks at me, and I have this Reese's Pieces pack in my hand that I have to let go of. And I dropped it back in the thing, and my mom grabbed me by the scruff of my neck, and she pulls me aside into a corner, and she says, "Don't you know you're a Black boy in America?" And that's that.
Wow.
Ooh, we're all taking that one home. So thank you. Tell a story about a time you should have spoken up and did not.
I'll go on this one. It's an embarrassing one, but I was young, and I was in my 20s, early 20s, and I was working at a junior level at a company. And I had a boss's boss who was a woman, and she was pretty successful. I sat kind of right outside her office, and I admired her, and I watched her build that company. And the company really started to work. And then the men at the company made a story about her and fired her. And I knew that it wasn't true. I knew that it wasn't a specific story. It was a whole narrative about her. She wasn't competent, or she didn't understand money, or she didn't, you know, it was a whole story about her. And they wanted to take over, and they wanted her gone. And they didn't want a woman to be running that company. And I knew I should have spoken up. I was really young. I was just starting out. I had no power. It wouldn't have made a difference. But for years I sat with that, and I thought I probably wouldn't have made a difference, but I knew it wasn't true, and I was too scared, and I didn't do anything. And I still know that woman today, and she never got her career back, and she was amazing, and she is a hero.
Oh, Keri, thank you for that one. Makes me want to go fight somebody.
And Claudia, really quickly, Keri, there's so many examples of that, where these narratives get created bit by bit and pieced together, and then destroy people. One thing that
I hate to have to share that one.
No,
I probably shouldn't have shared that one.
No,
yeah,
it's an important story to share, I think. One thing that we thought, Claudia, is like, if you guys have interesting prompts that you'd love to throw in the chat, do that, because we're all into gathering more prompts. So please drop in more prompts, and Claudia, I'll give it back to you. Sorry.
Oh, Fred, thank you so much. I had it in like capital letters. Remind folks to share prompts. And then I was so excited to hear y'all's stories. Another prompt: share a story about a courageous conversation.
The one that Keri just shared.
Agreed.
Yes, she wins.
Agreed.
That's... Wait, can I give you a prompt, Claudia?
Yeah, yes, you may. But Kamal, you have an answer? Do you have a story?
Come on, do it, and then I'm gonna. I've got one.
Okay, super quick. When I was at Sundance, I got an opportunity to write this, research project called Making a Reality, which Keri supported me on, and it was, when I did all this interviewing with people around art and technology, there was a particular tech company that wasn't coming out looking so good at the time. And there was just some real blatant critiques of this tech company. And then the tech company invited me to come and present to their entire staff about these critiques. And so I'm walking into the headquarters in Silicon Valley. This is, 100 people in the room, streaming out to every single desk in the entire headquarters. I don't know, maybe the whole global team. And I had to basically tell them to their face what the critique was. And this is before Techlash and all the other stuff. And I remember just being wanting to, it was one of those, you have to really pull it up from the bottom to come in and do this. And I was really intimidated, but it was amazing because after I finished the talk, well, first of all, people started streaming in from all over. We ended up with so many more people in the room and everybody was eager to hear it. And afterwards, this one guy came to me and said, how can we subvert this from the inside? And a month later, he sent me a redacted email that he sent to the entire staff of the whole tech company about how they can't create a white boy utopia and how they have to create an inclusive future. And so, that was an awesome moment where I was scared SHIT-less and something, came out of it. That was
so the white boy utopia. One of the things that you and I talked about, Kamal, you brought up was like how simply you can actually tell a story, good or bad. It's so I think that the example you brought up was Manifest Destiny. I worry a lot about the way this plays out in constructs of labeling. So when we say anti-maskers, do we have a picture, but do we know what we're saying? It's these very simple, really short stories, which are names actually our politicians are really, we've been living with the wall in the US for a long time. Politicians are really adept at kind of labeling things in ways that kind of push us in this direction, not in the direction we want to be going. Claudia, tell us a story about the last time you cried on a plane. Just think about Uzo's story.
This is on the plane to Costa Rica. I decided to watch Just Mercy, which if you haven't seen, you should see. As a civil rights attorney, I'm a bit embarrassed about the fact that it took me so long to watch it, but I watched it on the airplane and began to cry somewhere, I don't know, midway through the film, and was crying so hard that I had snot all over my face and my husband started to rub my back. And the flight attendant walked by and stopped and looked at me and wondered whether or not she should attend to my needs. And I was just pointing at the screen like, no, it's just Michael B. Jordan. He kills me.
We've all had that experience. Unfortunately for me, it was made in Manhattan, but it's otherwise it's okay. So we have a very short 10 minutes left, and I want to end at least a minute or two early because I always believe in that. So I'd love to see if there's any questions that really stood out as people were watching in the chat. If anybody saw a question that we didn't get to, or if there's somebody who wants to do it, I'd love to.
I just want to say how much I love the chat. There's so many great, actually just contributions. I don't even know from questions, but it's just really active group.
I know, and it's I feel like they're answering the questions, for us. So I'm just oh, we don't have to answer that question because there was 18 different examples put in already. It's kind of amazing, and the prompts are fantastic. So Claudia, we should definitely be getting all those, and we will be collecting all these prompts, and they'll be there. Then we've been given permission to go over, which is exactly the opposite of what my rules are. But we'll go. We want. I may ask just one question for you guys, unless there's something in the, I know, rule breaker. Because I'm not seeing anything unless you guys saw something that we thought you wanted to answer. Claudia? Kamal?
I just want to double click on what someone said about short, but honest. And
right.
That there's something about vulnerability and authenticity that cuts across the, proverbial BS or whatever.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I feel like I've had a lot of people in my life tell me that what I couldn't say, and I was just yeah, you know, don't tell me what I can say. Like, it's like that people can when it happens. Please, you can always say that. But it's like, but I'm like, I'm not gonna be the one who self-commits. Claudia,
but let me just for the sake of argument here, you've framed up so beautifully, Fred, this question of illuminations, and I know that mine was probably the longest, and you know, so I'm not in a good position to talk about length in that respect. But I do think for the you know, I read in the chat people talking about, you know, telling stories as you're working at a for fundraising, or telling stories for various reasons, and I think to sort of obsess about length when you're a storyteller, and I know this from all the stories we hear and work on, you know, at Sundance and elsewhere, that isn't really the key. The stories find their length. It's the authenticity of the story, and it's the honesty that you bring to it. And I don't think it's right or wrong to have a story that's 30 seconds or 3 minutes or an hour if it's coming from the heart. And I feel like you can have the confidence of that as a storyteller, and I just think you have to give yourself that permission, and stories find their right length. You find that, you know, think about the novel you love that takes you days and weeks to read, or the short film, you know, they're both wonderful.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, like, and we talked about this, like, which is that Middlemarch for me is one of the best stories of, it's a novel, it's a big fat novel about kind of systems and the way they kind of interconnect. And I honestly, whenever I've given it to people on my teams to read it, like, I know I'm the only one who reads it again. So it's like, I think we can go for sprawling and capturing, and but I don't, like I said, more different stories. Kamal, you unmuted.
I wanted to.
Uzo.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to say, just to piggyback on what Keri, you're saying, actually somebody that you and I both know very well, who's a friend of yours, who's actually my editor. I think when I came in with my last novel, said something that has resonated with me, which is like, it doesn't have to be a big book to be a big book, which is just that, to what you're saying is like, divorce, like what you think a story should be from what you actually want to tell. And that's where you'll find the space to actually write.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then that's so beautiful. That's so beautiful.
It's like, it's a great problem. There is a question in the chat box, in the chat, whatever it's called, which is from Sharon, which is that, do you ever worry your story just might be just not that interesting to people, especially people not in your field or in your family? And so I think in its essence, we're getting to that when we talk about the notion of authenticity and honesty, which is that things get interesting when they get real. I'm curious, any thoughts on that?
Wait, I didn't, can you say, I don't see the question, so I've lost.
It's way back. It was basically, a question was like, what if you, like, I do worry that your story is not interesting to people who aren't in your field or in
I think the more specific a story is, that I think it's really important that you tell your own story with detail and specificity, or any story with detail and specificity. The connections will be made, because the human experience is full of those connections. I think if a story is general and doesn't get grounded in the specifics of your individual experience, that's where it will fail to connect. So I think the more specific to your experience, the better, actually.
Yeah.
I'm just going to say that I do this for a living, and I am pretty sure that every time I start a book that I'm like, no one is going to want to read what I have to say. So I think that fear is a very universal one. And I think it's a valid one, because, you know, I say this also to my students, the truth is no one cares about your story. Your job is to make them care. And so your job is to sit down and make sure that you're doing the work to like make people engage with that story.
Yeah. Kamal?
This one thing about super short stories and the difference between, I went to this conference called Constellations, and it was about narrative change strategy. And what I loved about the framing there was that they talked about a single story being a star in the sky, and a narrative being the way we draw the picture between the stars into a constellation in the sky. And I think like sometimes we have these narratives, like you said, The Wall, which can be very, very short stories, but then there's there's the way that all of these other small stories all kind of come together to create a narrative. And especially for this community that's trying to shift to a different future around social justice and climate, just thinking about our individual little stories in the context of what narrative, what constellation are we framing here.
I love that point. I mean, and it's really stuck with me since the first time we spoke. Claudia, do you have anything? And then actually, we are given a time. We do have to stay on time. So yeah, Claudia.
Oh yeah, we can stay on time. I just want to say that I do think that we storytell for an audience, but we don't really storytell for the audience. Like I don't think you should be thinking about how to please or how to entertain. I think we just have a responsibility to tell our stories, period, no matter what.
I couldn't agree with you more. And so I'm going to ask you all to tell me one quick story about one thing you felt during this conversation, and it's like a one sentence. So, Claudia, what was it, like one sentence on what you felt you got out of this conversation?
I like hanging out with my friends.
Even if there's like hundreds and hundreds of them, because there are. Kamal, what's one sentence?
Just courageous conversations that really stuck with me.
I love that. Carrie?
Appropriately vulnerable and very connected.
Uzo?
Carrie doesn't play. I'm just gonna leave it at that.
And then I'm gonna say I felt love. So we always end on love. So we're out. Bye guys.